To continue our series in Revelation, and our focus today will be chapter 15, which is the shortest chapter in Revelation. That does not mean it will be the shortest service in this series, though. We'll see how that goes. They've been going pretty long the last few weeks, but as we begin into chapter 15, as always, we're mindful of what we have discussed and learned and processed up until this point, which has been a lot. Going back to chapter 1, working our way through each chapter, each scene, the switching of the scenes from scenes of eternal bliss and rejoicing and reward to scenes of judgment and destruction. And that has been a pattern all throughout the Revelation. And it makes sense because it's Johannine Style, who majors on the contrasting of light and darkness, good and evil, blessing and judgment, etc., etc. We could go on and on as far as the themes that are developed in Johannine literature, and especially in the Revelation. And I want you to pay attention. We're going to read through chapter 14 as a preparation for unpacking the 8 verses in chapter 15. And I want you to notice as we read chapter 14 and then chapter 15, the alternating scenes of blessing and judgment. In chapter 14, verses 1 through 5 that we looked into last week, or the week before that actually, you have a scene of blessing. Verses 12 and 13 are a scene of blessing. 6 and 11 and 14 through 20 are scenes of judgment. Some would argue that verses 14, 15, 16 are not, but as we discussed last week, it definitely fits the context and what it's being drawn from. And then in chapter 15, I want you to notice the pattern. Verse 1 will begin with a theme or a scene of judgment, and then it's interrupted, as has been the case several times throughout Revelation. You think in chapter 8 and other places in the Revelation where you have the introduction of a scene that may be judgment, and then it's interrupted by a scene of blessing, and then there's a return to the theme or the scene of judgment. And we're going to see that in chapter 15. So I'm showing you that as a visual to prep you mentally so when we get to it, you can see it better, hopefully. So let's begin reading in chapter 14. We're going to read through the entire chapter, and then we're going to start breaking down chapter 15. Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the roar of many waters and like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps. And they were singing a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and before the elders. And no one could learn that song except the 144,000 who had been ransomed from the earth. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. It is these who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been redeemed or ransomed from mankind as firstfruits for God and the Lamb. And in their mouth was no lie, for they are blameless. So you have this scene of eternal blessing, and then watch what happens. Then I saw another angel flying directly overhead with an eternal gospel, to proclaim to those who dwell on the earth. Now, we discussed last week that this is not good news aspect of the gospel. It's the judgment side of the gospel, because those who dwell on the earth is always in a negative light in Revelation. We looked at all those verses and how that phrase, those who dwell on the earth, is developed in Revelation, and it's never in a positive light. To every nation and tribe and language and people. And he said with a loud voice, "Fear God and give Him glory, because the hour of His judgment has come. And worship Him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of water." And another angel followed, saying, "Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication." And another angel, a third, followed them, saying with a loud voice, "If anyone worships the beast and its image, and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he also will drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of His anger. And he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest, day or night, these worshippers of the beast and its image, and whoever receives the mark of its name." Here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and their faithfulness in Jesus. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, "Write this, blessed are they who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them." Then I looked, and behold a white cloud, and seated on the cloud one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head, and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, "Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap is come, for the harvest of the earth is fully ripe." So he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the altar, and the angel who has authority over the fire, and he called with a loud voice to the one who has the sharp sickle, "Put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe." So the angel swung his sickle across the earth and gathered the grape harvest of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia. Which brings us to chapter 15. And we're going to see it begins in verse 1, setting or continuing a scene of judgment. "Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous. 7 angels, having the 7 last plagues, for in them the wrath of God is complete." Again, if we look in verse 1, we're going to see, as we just read, it's setting the scene for judgment to take place. And we're going to see this in detail beginning in chapter 16, the 7 angels with the 7 bowls of wrath, thumos, to be poured out on the earth in the same fashion as a buildup, like the seals and the trumpets, a series of 7 which climax or end or find their fulfillment with the day of the Lord being a day of salvation for the faithful and a day of judgment for the unfaithful. But there are scenes that are connected. What I want us to see here is that there are scenes that are connected throughout John. And you've probably recognized this pattern because I've pointed it out, maybe not in those terms, but there are scenes that are connected by rhythmic phrases. Even in English, they're rhythmic. And connecting words or shared words that reoccur, and those words reoccur to connect scenes in Revelation. And usually they're thematically linked in that they are themes or scenes of judgment or blessing. But that's not always the case, but oftentimes it is. But we have these linking of scenes through these connecting words and rhythmic phrases, and I want to point that out to you. And I also want to show you this pattern of an introducing of a scene of judgment in this case, which is going to be interrupted with a scene of blessing, and then there'll be a return to the scene of judgment. So let's look at verse 1 again, and I have highlighted specified words so that you can pick up on these rhythmic phrases and connecting words that are literary strategy in connecting the scenes throughout Revelation, because seeing the connection throughout the whole of Revelation is the key to interpreting it correctly and rightly. And so I've highlighted some words here, and then I'm going to show you one example. This is just one among many, and I want you to take this home with you, and you look for this same process, this same linking of scenes through rhythmic phrases and recurring words. Okay, so watch this. Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous. 7 angels having the 7 last plagues. And I want you to notice what I have highlighted there. And then I want you to watch this. When we go back to Revelation chapter 8, we're going to see that it's a scene or a theme along the theme of judgment as well there. But watch this. Look at the words I have highlighted, and watch this in chapter 8. In chapter 8, verse 2, then I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. Be thinking of what's highlighted. Then I saw, the phrase. Pay attention to that phrase in Revelation. Then I saw. And then you have 7 angels and the 7 last plagues, which we're going to find out that these 7 last plagues are 7 bowls, 7 golden bowls, which we're also going to find out are bowls of wrath, but they're also bowls that contain the prayers of the saints, calling for justice and vindication in the earth, which can only ultimately be brought by what? The day of the Lord. The day of the Lord. That is the only thing that will ultimately bring the fullest and truest sense of justice to the earth. So watch this. Then I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets. Now I'm going to expand, and we're getting ahead of the text in Revelation 15. But I want to stay with chapter 8 for just a few verses, and I have words specifically highlighted because we're going to see them appear in chapter 15. Why are we going to see them appear? Because rhythmic phrases, connecting words, linking scenes and themes. So we're linking, let me just spell it out. We're linking the 7 bowls with the 7 trumpets. Okay? Imagine that. These series of 7, these cycles of 7, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. And when you study Revelation, guess what they all end with? The exact same thing. So they're not some chronological layout playing out in Revelation. These are visionary experiences that are articulating spiritual realities and spiritual truth. And so each of these series of 7 are leading to the consummation of the kingdom of God and the judgment of the wicked on the day of the Lord. So let's keep reading in verse 3. And another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. And the golden altar in heaven would be likened to which altar in the tabernacle or the temple? The tabernacle or the temple? The altar of what? Incense. The altar of incense, not the altar of sacrifice, because the altar of sacrifice was made out of what? Copper. Copper. In English translations it says bronze, but it's actually copper. Bronze has an alloy added in it, so that wouldn't be what it's saying in the Hebrew. It's pure, because everything in the tabernacle and the temple was made out of pure copper, pure silver, and pure gold. There were no alloys in any of the furnishings of the tabernacle or the temple. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Again, pay attention to the words I have highlighted, because they're purposely highlighted so that you can connect everything. Then the angel took the censer, the golden censer, and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth. And here's that phrase that is linked to the day of the Lord time and time again in Revelation. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. We know this is speaking of the day of the Lord. This language there that I don't have highlighted there, peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake, are all ways of describing the day of the Lord. And we know this is the day of the Lord because in verse 1, which I did not include, when does this occur? In conjunction with the 7th seal. And we know that the 6th and 7th seal are clearly the day of the Lord. And so the 7th seal is kind of a retelling of the 6th seal. And the 6th seal is in response to what? The 5th seal. And the 5th seal is what? Y'all didn't know we were having quiz and review. I didn't either. But it's all connected, guys. And what is the 5th seal? Revelation chapter 6. The 5th seal was open, and you have a scene of the martyrs before the throne of God under the altar. And they're crying out, how long, O Lord, holy and true before you, vindicate us for our blood that was shed upon those who dwell upon the earth. When are you going to come? When are you going to bring justice? When are you going to make things right? And then you have the day of the Lord in response to that. And so everything in Revelation concerning judgment, whether it be the judgment of the seals, the judgment of the trumpets, or the judgment of the bowls, as we'll see in chapter 16, they are all thematically linked to the prayers of the saints. And the day of the Lord will ultimately come when His people have been persecuted till the cup has been full, and then He will pour out His wrath on the unbelieving world, and He will vindicate the saints on that day. So I kind of got ahead of myself there and actually talked about some things weeks and weeks and weeks ago, and we're like, man, that was way too long ago. But you got to see the connection, because these are continual themes that are developed, maybe using different language and imagery at times, but there's always present these connecting words. And if you pay attention to the connecting words, you can connect the scenes, and you'll see that Revelation is telling us the same thing over and over again. Over and over again with each of these series of sevens. So back to verse 1. Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous. 7 angels having the 7 last plagues. Why are they called the last plagues? Because this is the final series of 7. Most people would think, well, they're the last ones in the last days of the last days. No, it's talking about as far as his visionary experiences. They are the last plagues in the visionary experiences. It is the last series of judgment, the 7 bowls, or the 7 last plagues. For in them the wrath of God is complete. And so with these bowl judgments, it will complete the series of 7, and the wrath of God will be complete. But in all of them, they all end with the same climactic event, the day of the Lord. In verse 2, and I saw what appeared to be a sea of glass. Where was that mentioned? Revelation chapter 4, which is what? A throne room scene. So it takes our attention and our minds to the throne room. And this is imagery from the tabernacle and the temple, because remember, they are patterned after what is in heaven. And so you have the tabernacle, which was first erected, and outside of the holy place was what? The copper basin, which came to be known or called in Solomon's temple as what? The sea. And so you have this sea before the throne room. And this was patterned after what is in heaven. And so we see that described here when he says, and I saw what appeared to be a sea of glass. The difference between here in chapter 4 is it adds mingled with fire, which fire usually represents what in the Bible? Judgment. Okay? And it is going to show us those who have passed through the judgment. And here they are described as we continue reading, and also those who had conquered the beast or overcome the beast and its image and the number of its name, standing beside or upon, epi in Greek, the sea of glass with harps of God in their hand. Notice that I have that word highlighted, conquered. It is one among many words that is used thematically in Johannine literature. Let me show you a graph that articulates that point. It's the Greek word nikao. It occurs 28 times in the New Testament. You guys see that? Where does it occur overwhelmingly more than anywhere else? Revelation. It occurs 17 times in Revelation. 17 of the 28 occurrences are in Revelation. You think it's an important word to understand in Revelation? Yes. Where is it occurring second most? 1 John. Why do I point that out? Because it shows forth evidence of same authorship between 1 John and Revelation. And I point that out because in recent scholarship, there is a rejection of Johannine, the apostle, John, the apostle, being the author of 1 John and Revelation. So there's this, there's a difference in vocabulary and style. Well, duh. You got a letter and you got an apocalypse. Of course you're going to have a difference in vocabulary and style because you got different genres. And that's why it's important to recognize different genres and how they function. And one is communicated pretty much entirely in symbolic or metaphorical language. Of course, there's going to be a lot of words that are unique to Revelation that don't occur in John or 1st, 2nd, or 3rd John. But there are also words that occur pretty much only in Johannine literature. And you can't explain that without coming to the conclusion that the same person is involved in the writing of all of them. Even here in this word, and there are better examples of this than this one, you have it in Revelation a ton, then 1 John, but you also have it occurring in the Gospel of John. It occurs once in Luke and 3 times in Romans. That's it in the New Testament. But it occurs in 3 of the categories within Johannine literature, which tells us that it's the same author. Now, this word is translated differently depending on what English version you use. It's translated here in the ESV as conquered. But when you go to the New King James, which I used early on because I like the word it translates it from better in chapters 2 and 3 in regards to the 7 churches. He who overcomes, he who overcomes, he who overcomes, he overcomes. The promise to each of the 7 churches, he who overcomes. It's that same word, Nikao. And the New King James translates it the majority of the time as overcome. Whereas the ESV, the majority of the time, translates it, as we just read in chapter 15, as what? Conquer. Now, it carries the connotation of both of those words. And neither one of them are wrong, but sometimes one could be preferred over the other depending on the context. But this is what you'll see in the English translations, or at least these 2. Now, it's a theme going back to the 7 churches. And I want you to think about what each of them were called to overcome. Because you had 5 of the churches, 5 of the 7 churches were rebuked by the Lord because they were in danger of not overcoming. Therefore, forfeiting the blessing that was promised to each of them. So let's review those right quick. In Ephesus, they had lost their first love, or their first works had ceased. Their works were lacking, and based on the context, it's most likely in their outreach and in their witness to those who needed to hear the gospel. In Pergamum, they needed to overcome their tolerance of false teachers and teaching, in particular the doctrine of Balaam and the teaching of the Nicolaitans. And it was also said that their works were lacking, or their works were incomplete, or they were not perfect. In Thyatira, it was said that their last works were more than their first works, so they had made ground in that area, but they had a problem of tolerating the false teachers known as Jezebel. In Sardis, they were spiritually dead. Their works were lacking. Their garments were sold, and they were compromisers with pagan society. In Laodicea, they were lukewarm, greedy. They thought they were rich, in need of nothing. They didn't realize they were poor, wretched, blind, miserable, naked. and their works were lacking. So in all of these churches and their rebukes, what is prominent, overlapping reality, is that their works were lacking. They were failing in obedience in particular areas of their life. And Jesus said it wasn't okay. Matter of fact, He said it wasn't okay in the sense that if you do not fix it, you will lose the reward. And the reward is euphemistically expressed in different ways to each of the 7 churches, but they all mean eternal life. And so they were in danger of not overcoming, which is why He says it this way, going back to Revelation 2 and verse 26, He who overcomes, and then in tautology, He says, and keeps my works until the end. What does it mean that this is tautologous? Overcoming equal sign, keeping my works until the end. Now, isn't it crazy that the devil has infiltrated the church so much that it is said that works are not necessary for salvation? But Jesus equates works with salvation to all of the 7 churches. And so it's egregious, living in the 21st century, that it would ever be falsely equivocated that works are not necessary for salvation. That is a conflation of what Paul wrote when he said that we are saved by faith, saved by grace through faith. You still have the through faith part. They don't talk about that. By grace through faith, not of works. The not of works is works of the Mosaic law. It's not saying works are not necessary. It's not saying obedience isn't necessary. It's saying works of the Mosaic law in Paul's argument, because he is arguing against those who are commanding the Gentiles to be circumcised and to eat kosher, or they can't be Christians, or they can't be God's people. And so that's what Paul is rebuttaling. But Jesus clearly believes that you have to have works and you have to maintain works, and they can't start slipping or lacking, or you will lose or forfeit eternal life. And that's why he says, he who overcomes and keeps my works unto the end, to him will I give power over the nations. So overcoming equals obeying the commandments of Jesus, and without doing so, one cannot overcome. We see that said in Revelation 12. Now, this doesn't, let me say this. It doesn't undermine the necessity of Jesus' sacrifice for sins. That is necessary, but so are works. So any model that says you need one and not both is heretical. Heretical. Any preaching that exists that says you do not have to maintain good works to be saved and have eternal life is heretical based on what the Bible, what Jesus himself says. And that is said specifically here in Revelation 12. And they overcame. There's that word. Or you could say conquered. And they conquered him. The him here is who? The dragon. By the blood of the Lamb. And. Say and. And. The blood of the Lamb is not enough. You know why I know that? Because Jesus shed His blood for every human being. If the Lamb shedding His blood could save, then everyone's saved. It has to be appropriated through what? Faith. And faith without works is what? Dead. It's the faith of demons, James says. And the doctrine of demons is being taught in churches across the world today, especially in America. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, or the word of their witness, the teaching of Jesus. They were faithful to the teaching of Jesus Christ, insomuch, and they did not love their lives to the death. They were so willing to obey the teaching of Jesus and trust in His sacrifice for their sins that they would die for Him before they would compromise walking in faithfulness and fidelity to Him. Now, you may think when you hear that they overcame him, the dragon, by the blood of the Lamb, the word of the testimony, and they did not love their lives to death, that doesn't gel with what we read a chapter later. Because we're talking about the theme of conquering or overcoming. Remember what it said in Revelation 13, and this is in reference to the beast. It says it was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. I thought in chapter 12, they overcame the dragon who empowers the beast, but here, a chapter later, we have the beast overcoming them. This is where you need to understand the perspective. Because you have earthly perspective and heavenly perspective intertwined throughout Revelation as well. And so, what does it mean that the beast made war with the saints and overcome them? Temporarily speaking, concerning what is seen in this life, the beast wars with the saints and overcomes them. Kind of like the two beasts, Rome and religious Judaism. The two beasts partnered against Jesus, and what? They killed him. Which appears or looks like, from an earthly or worldly perspective, that what? They won. Jesus is dead. They have conquered him. He's no more. But the irony is that what they thought was overcoming Jesus was actually guaranteeing Jesus overcoming them. Why? Because he was raised from the dead. And the same promise is available to those who are in Christ, that even though the world may kill or martyr God's people, if they are faithful in that and are martyred, it looks like the beast overcomes them. But in reality, what will happen on the day of the Lord when the resurrection takes place? They will actually overcome the beast. That's the irony of the gospel, is that you don't love your life to death. You're willing to obey Jesus at any and all costs. And if the beast does conquer you, you actually conquered it. Because martyrdom in Revelation is a guarantee for eternal life. And it's guaranteed victory over the beast and entrance into the eternal kingdom. Now, we need to ask ourselves what that looks like in our day. If Jesus were to come and speak to us directly, what might He say we need to overcome? What areas may we compromise? Or what areas are we not faithful? Would Jesus come and say, deal with this? This is where we take it home and we look into the mirror of God's Word and we submit ourselves completely to the whole of the teaching of Jesus and the apostles. Back to verse 2. And I saw what appeared to be a sea of glass mingled with fire, and those who had conquered the beast. Remember, the beast had conquered them from an earthly perspective, but here, from a heavenly perspective, they conquered the beast and its image and the number of its name, standing beside the sea of glass with harps of God in their hands. Why do we have that unique phrase, with harps of God in their hands. What's that about? Do you think it's to link this scene with the earlier scene? Let's see. In Revelation chapter 5, in verse 8, it says, "And when they had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls." Golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song, golden bowls and a song. "Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you have ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you have made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth." Now let's see how it's linked again to chapter 14. And it makes sense that it would be linked to chapter 14 because it's the same group. Those who conquered the beast are the 144,000. This euphemistic language to describe the faithful people of God. In 14 verse 2, "And I heard a voice from heaven like the roar of many waters, like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps." Watch this, just like we just read in chapter 5. "And they were singing a new song." We talked about a new song being a song of deliverance, a song of salvation and victory. And they were singing a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and before the elders. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who had been ransomed from the earth. So you see the link of the harps, but also in what follows in verse 3, they were singing a new song, because we're going to see that phrase appear here in just a moment. So let's read verse 2 again. "And I saw what appeared to be a sea of glass mingled with fire, also those who had conquered the beast and its image and the number of its name, standing beside the sea of glass with harps of God in their hands." Watch this. "And they sing the song of Moses." This is the new song. "The servant of God, and the song of the Lamb." The Lamb. So it's the song of Moses and it's the song of the Lamb. Why? The same reason the 144,000 are described as they are in chapter 7 and then redescribed as an innumerable multitude. Because the 144,000 represents the faithful people of God from all ages. And so it has the song of Moses representing the first covenant and the song of the Lamb representing the new covenant. So the faithful from both covenants, or from all ages, you could say, are singing joyfully in this heavenly scene to the Lord. Now, something that I asked you to do, and if you didn't see it, I would encourage you to do this because it'll really help you process this chapter, and we don't have the time to do it, but that is to read the Song of Moses. What is the Song of Moses? Well, there's actually 2 songs of Moses. Did you know that? One song is in Exodus, which makes sense why he would allude to the Song of Moses, because what has been a developed theme throughout Revelation? The Exodus. The seals, the trumpets were patterned after the judgments in Exodus. We're going to see the same thing will occur with the bowl judgments, the bowls of wrath. So you have Exodus 15, but also Deuteronomy 32. Why is that important? Because Exodus 15 is celebrating the victory over the beast, Egypt, and Pharaoh and his army. And then in Deuteronomy 32, that is written by Moses and rehearsed before the people of God right before they go into the land that was promised to them. And he rehearsed that song. And you should go and read it because it has a lot of the language that we see in Revelation chapter 15. And so they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, and the content is going to echo the Old Testament a lot. It's going to echo Exodus 15, Deuteronomy 32, much of the Psalms and the prophets. And I'll point out some of what it echoes as we go along. But let's read what they said. Great and amazing are your deeds, O Lord God the Almighty. Just and true, or righteous and true, are your ways. Let me ask you a question. How many of you crave justice and truth? What is right and what is true? And that can only be determined by a source outside of oneself, and that being the Creator. There's only one entity that exists that has the right to determine what is righteous and true, and that is God. That's why John's gospel has Jesus come to the earth and say, I came to relay what the Father has said to me. I have shown you His judgments. I have given you His word. You have that theme all throughout the gospel when Jesus is teaching the ways of God. And here, the faithful, this is the only way you will be a part of this group, by the way, is if you crave justice and truth, and you will bow yourself and acknowledge that that can only be determined by God as He has revealed Himself through Jesus Christ. Just and true are your ways, O King of the nations. Now there's a textual variant here that I need to point out, because depending on what English translation you use, it may read differently. So we see here in the ESV, and I'm talking about the last part that I have highlighted, O King of the nations. That's how it is translated in the ESV based on what Greek manuscripts they translated into English. But watch how it is said in the New King James. Just and true are your ways, what? O King of the saints. So we have King of the saints. In the ESV, we had King of the nations. They're not spelled the same in Greek either. And you can't have any confusion because they look similar even. Then you have in the Lexham English Bible, which is drawn from other Greek manuscripts, King of the ages. And what the New King James has, King of the saints, is a confusion of what does exist in other Greek manuscripts, King of the ages. But which one is most likely the original? Because we have good evidence for this, King of the ages. Good evidence meaning there are a lot of different Greek manuscripts that date to antiquity that read King of the ages. But we have equal evidence of Greek manuscripts that date to antiquity that say King of the nations. And I believe that the most likely original is what you see in the ESV in O King of the nations. And here's why. Because I believe Revelation is making use of Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 10. And it has it in inverted order. But let me try to show you why I believe this. In Jeremiah 10, in verse 6, it says, "There is none like you, O Yahweh. You are great, and your name is great in might. Who would not fear you, O King of the nations?" Well, we're going to see here in just a moment in verse 4 in Revelation 15, it's going to say, who would not fear you? But it has it in inverted order. In verse 3, it says, O King of the nations. But in verse 4, it's going to say, who would not fear you? And so I believe this is echoing Jeremiah 10, which is mocking the idols that are worshipped in Jeremiah's day and saying, your idol, no idol compares to the real, true, and living God. And so he goes on and says, for this is your due, for among all the wise ones of the nations and in all their kingdoms, there is none like you. And we see that immediately in verse 4. Who shall not fear you, O Lord, and glorify your name? So when we go back to 3, we have, O King of the nations, quoted from Jeremiah 10. And then we have in verse 4, who shall not fear you, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy. For all nations shall come and worship before you, for your judgments have been manifested. Notice what I have highlighted there. Who shall not fear you, O Lord, and glorify your name? Doesn't that sound familiar? It's the antithesis of what the beast worshipers were saying in Revelation 13. So they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, this was their worship. Who is like the beast? It's what they feared. That's why the fear of the Lord is prerequisital for understanding, wisdom, and knowledge, and beginning on the path to knowing God. Because you will worship what you fear. Did you know that? If you fear losing the approval of other humans, you will bow to them, because that's what worship is. It's not necessarily singing, it's what you submit to, what you obey. And so here we have those worshiping the dragon and the beast, and they say, who is like the beast? You know what that's a direct quote from, ironically? It's taking what is said about Yahweh from Exodus 15. After they crossed the Red Sea and the beast was judged, Egypt was judged. They said, who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? And it goes on to praising Yahweh for the victory. But this is ascribed by the world, those who worship the beast, to the self-serving system that they're trapped in. And that worship ultimately goes back to who? The dragon. So you have two categories of people in Revelation: those who worship the true and living God, and any other worship actually is traced back to who? The dragon. So every human being either worships God or the devil, and there is no in between. You are loyal and subservient to one or the other. So let's continue. Verse 4, who shall not fear you, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy. For all nations shall come and worship before you. And this part is a quote from what? Psalm 86, verse 9 and 10. All the nations you have made shall come and worship before you, O Lord, and shall glorify your name. For you are great and do wondrous things. You alone are God. Now I want you to look at this last part of verse 4. For all nations shall come and worship before you, for your judgments have been manifested. But in the ESV, it has it translated this way: for your righteous acts have been revealed or manifested. So which is it? Judgments, your judgments, or your righteous acts? I believe the ESV translators chose to word it this way. It's a very difficult Greek word, which was difficult to translate from Hebrew into Greek. and then to capture in Greek here and translate into English. It's very difficult sometimes in translation process. But they likely are thinking of the quotation that is taken from, going to verse 10, following, all nations shall come and worship before you and glorify your name, for you are great and do wondrous things. So they say your righteous acts have been revealed based on, what it's referring to or an allusion to. But I think overall, your judgments captures better of what it should be said in English. Your judgments have been manifested, or your decrees, a lot of times this word would be chok in the Old Testament, like your statutes, your principles, your judgments, your assessment of what is good and what is bad have been revealed, would be a way of saying it. And then verse 5 says, after this I looked, and the sanctuary of the tent of witness in heaven was opened. What is the sanctuary? This part. The holy place and the holies of holies. Anytime we have this phrase that heaven was opened, whether it's the sanctuary or the temple, what is the context? Let me show you another occurrence. In 11:19, which is in conjunction with what? Anyone? The seventh trumpet. Then God's temple in heaven was opened. The throne room. And the ark of His covenant was seen. What is the ark of His covenant? What is it called in Revelation every time but this verse? The throne. And there were flashes of what? Lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail, which is clearly a reference to the day of the Lord. So this is in the context of judgment. Remember, verse 1 started out judgment. You have verses 2 through 4, which are kind of positive or blessing. The saints are rewarded. And then you have a return to the scene of judgment, a continuation of the thought began in verse 1. Do you guys see that? So after this I looked, and the sanctuary of the tent of witness was opened. And out of the sanctuary came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues, clothed in pure, bright linen with golden sashes around their chest, which is exactly how Jesus is described in chapter 1, verse 13, I believe. So these angels are associated with Jesus in their description here. And one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God who lives forever and ever. Remember what I said about connecting words and rhythmic phrases? What are the 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God connected to? By using this phraseology. Back to chapter 5. We've already looked at this verse, but it says, when He had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures, the 24 elders, fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and what? Golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. Why the difference? because I'll say these are the same bowls. But why are they called golden bowls of wrath and then golden bowls full of incense, and then it be explained that the incense is the prayers of the saints? Because it is the prayers of the saints that result in the wrath of God. Kind of like drinking the cup of Babylon results in drinking the cup of God's wrath, of the wine of His winepress. I mean, one leads to the other. And so the golden bowls full of incense are the golden bowls full of wrath, because it is the prayers of the saints that brings about the day of the Lord and the wrath of God leading up to the day of the Lord. So reading verse 7 again. And one of the four living creatures gave to the seven angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. And the sanctuary, the throne room, was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from His power. Can I stop here for a second? This is funny. But do you know why a lot of churches have smoke machines? It's this verse right here. They are creating heaven on earth for you. Yeah. But I think heaven flees environments where you're trying to literally produce what's in heaven and not understanding the principles and what God truly desires. The transformation and the understanding that transforms who we are from the inside out. The way we think, how we live, what we value, what we strive for, what we invest in. The sanctuary was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from His power. And no one could enter the sanctuary until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were finished. And this is talking as far as during the visionary experience. No one could enter the throne room, if you will, until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were finished. And in chapter 16, we are going to see these 7 bowls, like the 7 trumpets and the 7 seals, are judgment responses that build up to a climax, ending with the day of the Lord. But all of them, as we have demonstrated throughout this series, are directly connected to the prayers of the saints. That's why you have the 5th seal and all of the other connections that I showed you in this lesson, that the prayers of the saints are connected to God's judgments in each series that end with the day of the Lord. Any questions? No questions? All right. Would you stand?